Good afternoon, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Julie Segal, and I lead a climate finance policy program at Environmental Defence Canada. Let us start by acknowledging the land which we are on is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, who have lived here since time immemorial, and let us honor that. Le territoire sur lequel nous nous réunissons est le territoire ancestral et non cédé du peuple Algonquin Anishinaabe. Quand on parle aujourd'hui des impacts des grands banques canadiennes sur le climat, nous devons reconnaître comment leur investissement a affecté les communautés autochtones à la fois directement et par le biais de la relation avec la terre de Turtle Island. On behalf of climate and environmental justice groups across the country, we thank the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development for their leadership in summoning Canada's Big Five bank CEOs to answer for fueling the climate crisis. Les banques ont essayé de se protéger derrière l'Association des bancaires canadiennes, mais les élus de la Commission de l'environnement ont insisté à raison que les responsables des banques se présentent et s'expliquent. The CEOs of the banks, despite these summons, will appear only virtually. RBC, BMO, TD, CIBC, and Scotiabank should have faced parliamentarians in person instead of only appearing by video conference to explain how their financing is worsening the climate crisis for people in Canada. New rules to align finance with climate action remain the missing piece of Canada's climate plan. The Environment Committee's leadership in summoning the bank executives who tried to evade legitimate inquiry shows that finally Parliament is working to fill this gap and to set new rules to align finance with climate action. On vous remercie vraiment. Today, myself and colleagues will further outline why the investment decisions from Canadian bank executives make life harder for people across the country and climate change worse. The continued and significant investment in oil and gas hampers Canada's ability to reduce emissions and build climate resilience. The government must pass new policy to ensure banks and other financial institutions start helping instead of hindering climate action. We'll start with Greenpeace's Keith Stewart.
Thank you. When it comes to financing fossil fuel, Canada punches above its weight, and that's not something we should be proud of. Personally, I started talking to bankers back in 2008 about the urgent necessity of shifting their support from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Since then, essentially nothing has changed. The CEOs who will be appearing before the Parliamentary Committee later today will no doubt come with some lovely words, but we're hoping that our elected officials will follow the money. The inconvenient truth is that none of the banks have a plan that would align their loans and investments with our climate goals, and they continue to lobby against the very policies that would bring them into alignment. All of Canada's Big Five banks are in the top 20 globally when it comes to financing coal, oil, and gas. They put over $140 billion into fossil fuels last year, and since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, they have put $1.2 trillion into supporting and expanding the very fuels that are driving our climate crisis. I hope that our elected officials will ask those CEOs how much they could have done to fight rather than fuel the climate crisis if they had put that more than $1 trillion into climate solutions. We would be fools to believe that the banks are going to do the right thing out of the goodness of their heart. Banks will do the right thing, phase out their financing of fossil fuels, ramp up support for clean energy while respecting Indigenous rights, if and only if we require them to do so. The time for asking politely is over. We need our elected officials to regulate the banks so that the immense financial resources that they control help rather than hinder in the fight against the very wildfires, the extreme weather, the storms, the flooding that come with unchecked climate change. Thank you. I will now pass it over to Richard Brooks from Stand.earth.
It's unprecedented that our elected officials have summoned the heads of Canada's biggest banks to answer for their role in funding the climate crisis. Recall 2016, the devastating Fort Mac fires forced 80,000 people from their homes in the largest evacuation in Alberta's history. This climate-fueled disaster should have been a turning point in how Canadian banks finance fossil fuels. It was a national wake-up call for many of us just 6 months after the world pledged to reduce climate emissions in the Paris Climate Agreement. But fast forward to 2023. Canadians experienced our worst fire season ever, with smoky air blanketing major cities across the country and reaching as far away as Europe. What hasn't changed between 2016 and 2023? Our banks' financing of fossil fuels. Let's focus on the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC. As Canada's largest bank, they arguably set the tone and direction for the others. Yet since the Fort Mac fires and the Paris Agreement signatures, they've poured more than $256 billion USD into fossil fuels, outpacing the second bank, Scotiabank, at $192 billion. RBC is a top financier of methane gas expansion. They hold disproportionately large share of global fossil fuel financing relative to their market cap and total assets, even surpassing JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Bank of America in this metric. They are also the fourth largest financier of fossil fuel infrastructure expansion in the world and number one in Canada. Despite a lot of rhetoric around reconciliation from this bank, this is the bank that has most often stepped forward to defend controversial projects like the Coastal GasLink frack gas pipeline, which the United Nations has stated violates Indigenous rights. It is one thing to finance a project, it's another thing to be its marketing and damage control agent. On the renewable side, RBC severely underfunds the energy transition. For every dollar that they put into fossil fuels, only 37 cents goes to low-carbon energy, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Even with recent pledges to increase this amount, RBC will remain far below the 6-to-1 ratio that the International Energy Agency says is needed by 2030 to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals and diminish chances of more extreme weather. While some of our governments are investing heavily in clean energy, RBC lags behind. We need more from Canada's bank. Lastly, and I think this is important to restate as we look to our elected officials today to ask hard questions of the CEO of RBC, Dave McKay, RBC is the only Canadian bank currently under investigation by the Competition Bureau of Canada. This federal law enforcement agency is investigating claims that the bank is misleading consumers with climate action statements that don't square up with the bank's overfinancing of fossil fuels. And this underscores the need for stronger financial regulation to stop greenwashing and ensure banks help, not hinder, the energy transition. I urge our elected officials to ask tough questions of RBC CEO Dave McKay. It's time for RBC to change. I will now invite Pat Baudin with Greenpeace to talk about Canada's banking system that is driving climate change in French and why laws and regulations are needed. Patrick?
Le Réseau des groupes autochtones et environnementaux souhaite sincèrement remercier le Comité permanent de l'environnement et du développement durable pour le leadership dont ils ont fait preuve en convoquant les PDG des grandes banques canadiennes afin qu'ils rendent enfin des comptes quant à leur contribution à la crise climatique. Les banques ont tenté de se cacher derrière l'Association des banquiers du Canada, mais le comité s'est concentré sur l'importance, enfin, d'amener autant les sociétés pétrolières que les banques à rendre des comptes à la société sur la manière qu'elles contribuent actuellement à la crise climatique à travers leurs décisions et leur financement. Le leadership dont ont fait preuve les membres du comité témoigne du travail accompli au Parlement, qui reconnaît de plus en plus l'importance d'avoir de la réglementation pour le secteur financier parce que c'est le chaînon manquant actuellement quand on parle de lutte à la crise climatique. Les banques canadiennes freinent clairement le pays dans ses efforts visant à atteindre les objectifs de 2030 et 2050 quand on parle de lutte contre les changements climatiques, et le gouvernement doit adopter des lois et des règlements pour s'assurer que les banques et les institutions financières cessent de faire partie du problème et fassent plutôt partie de la solution. Lorsqu'on parle de financer les combustibles fossiles, le Canada surperforme et il n'y a pas de quoi être fier. La vérité dérangeante, c'est qu'actuellement, il n'y a aucune banque qui n'a de plan pour aligner ses prêts, ses investissements sur les objectifs climatiques et qui continue à faire des pressions pour que les politiques dont on a besoin ne soient pas adoptées. Les 5 grandes banques canadiennes sont parmi les 20 plus grands financiers dans le monde quand on parle de financer le charbon, le gaz et le pétrole. Elles ont investi 140 milliards de dollars canadiens dans les combustibles fossiles juste l'année dernière et depuis la signature de l'accord de Paris en 2015, c'est 1200 milliards de dollars qu'elles ont engloutis dans les combustibles fossiles qui sont à l'origine de la crise climatique. La plus grande banque du Canada, RBC, évidemment, est la pire et elle, à elle seule, elle a injecté 256 milliards de dollars dans les énergies fossiles depuis 2015. Non seulement ça, mais RBC, c'est un des principaux financiers quand on parle de l'expansion du gaz naturel liquéfié en 2023 au Canada. Elle a aussi une part complètement disproportionnée du financement mondial des énergies fossiles par rapport à sa capitalisation boursière et à son actif total. Elle dépasse même JP Morgan Chase, Citi et Bank of America. Quand on parle de RBC, on parle aussi du 4e plus gros financier de l'expansion des infrastructures de combustibles fossiles dans le monde et évidemment le premier au Canada. Au niveau des énergies renouvelables, RBC, elle sous-finance gravement la transition énergétique. Pourquoi? Parce que même selon Bloomberg, pour chaque dollar qui est investi dans les énergies fossiles par RBC, elle ne finance que 37 cents dans les énergies à faible teneur en carbone. Et même si elle s'est engagée à augmenter ce ratio-là, elle sera clairement très loin du ratio de 6 pour 1 que l'Agence internationale de l'énergie estime qu'il est nécessaire d'ici 2030 si on veut atteindre nos objectifs climatiques. On a besoin de beaucoup plus de la part des banques canadiennes et de la plus grande banque du Canada. Et c'est ça pourquoi on espère que nos élus vont demander au PDG de ces banques-là ce qu'ils auraient pu faire pour lutter contre la crise climatique au lieu de l'alimenter avec les centaines de milliards de dollars qu'ils ont investis dans les combustibles fossiles. Il faudrait être presque fou là, de penser que les banques vont s'autoréguler et agir de bonne foi quand on parle de lutte contre les changements climatiques. Les banques feront ce qu'il faut, c'est-à-dire de progressivement réduire le financement des combustibles fossiles, d'accroître le soutien aux énergies renouvelables, de respecter les droits autochtones, si et seulement si elles sont forcées de le faire. Le temps des demandes polies est révolu. C'est pourquoi on demande à nos élus de réglementer les banques afin que leurs immenses ressources financières contribuent, au lieu de nuire, à la lutte contre les feux de forêt, par exemple, les inondations, les tempêtes de plus en plus violentes qui résultent de la crise climatique actuelle. J'invite maintenant Julie Siegel d'Environmental Defense pour parler de l'importance de réglementer, de mettre des lois pour forcer les banques et le système financier à soutenir le plan du Canada sur les changements climatiques plutôt que de le ralentir comme c'est le cas actuellement.
Je vais remercier tous mes collègues pour les commentaires. Canadian Big Five banks are world leaders in terms of financing oil and gas. Each of Canada's Big Five banks have climate commitments, but none of them have a commensurate plan of action. Their voluntary climate commitments have proven fickle, with them continuing to overinvest in oil and gas and underinvest in clean climate solutions. Given the lack of positive progress from the institutions on their own, new rules are direly needed. Rules to align the financial system with climate action is the missing piece of Canada's climate plan. Designing a financial sector to align with climate action makes sense, given the significant climate-related risks and how those have already been harming people across the country. Our country has one of the world's worst climate records among wealthy countries, being the only G7 country where emissions have continued to rise since signing the Paris Agreement. The investment decisions made by our banks are holding the country back from climate progress. Until now, there have been no signs they would be held to account. The Environment Committee summoning these Big Five bank CEOs to explain how they're worsening the climate crisis is critical. Canada is globally recognized as a low-regulation jurisdiction and a laggard when it comes to aligning financial policy with climate action. Mais il y a des solutions sur la table pour remédier à ces problèmes. Je vais parler de le Climate Aligned Finance Act. Bill S-243 has been progressing through the Canadian Senate for the past 2 years. The Climate Aligned Finance Act is a ready-made, globally celebrated policy proposal, which our elected officials and senators should move forward quickly. The Climate Aligned Finance Act would address the huge problem of financial institutions investing in ways that make climate change worse. We need credible climate transition plans from these banks and financial institutions. Since they are not designing these on their own, we need rules to ensure they happen and are delivered. Ces politiques sont essentielles à l'action climatique et à la protection de l'économie du Canada. The best part is most Canadians want climate-aligned financial policy. They want new rules from the government on this. They want progress. Recent polling shows 65% of people across the country want sustainable finance regulation, and this rises to almost 80% if the rules explicitly counter greenwashing, which makes sense given the continued false green claims by banks and other financial institutions while they continue to finance fossil fuels. Encore, en remercie le comité pour ses progrès. Last week, the executives of Canada's large oil and gas companies testified before Parliament. Today, the bank executives will do the same. The link between oil, gas, and the banks to worsening the climate crisis is very clear. Over 40% of people in the country have been affected by wildfires. Workers are being increasingly harmed by extreme heat. Our climate and economic stability are increasingly at risk. Following the testimonies today, we hope Parliament implements the Climate Aligned Finance Act, requires credible climate transition plans from all financial institutions, and ensures that they help cut emissions and build resilience in line with Canada's climate plan. Nous sommes maintenant prêts à répondre à vos questions. We're now available for any questions. Merci beaucoup.
We will start the question period with reporters on Zoom. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons commencer avec la période de questions avec les journalistes en ligne sur Zoom. Si vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée, comme à l'habitude, une question et une sous-question, s'il vous plaît. Thank you. This will conclude the press conference. Merci.